when I am assessing the situation and see the Western mainstream media, especially the Wall Street Journal, even talking about a long war and how Israel has always been prepared for a short war, of course, this negates the Palestinian experience, which has been a rolling genocide for over 70 years now, almost 80 years now. And then if we can go further back. But at the same time, Professor Marandi, the dynamics that you've spoken of in terms of what kind of sentiment is built up in the region against Israel and the United States, the longer this goes on, it makes me wonder about your assessment of how the axis of resistance has been able to get so powerful in general. Because I think what we are seeing is, on the one hand, Israel overstepping its hand, and on the other, the axis of resistance, whether we're talking about Hezbollah or Ansarallah and Iran, and also maybe you can comment on the attacks on U.S. bases from the Cashapp Hezbollah and other regional forces. We are seeing a very powerful axis of resistance that is now getting more attention in terms of its capacity and its ability to assert the political direction that it wants to see. What do you have to say about the axis of resistance?
But yes, you're absolutely correct. And in 2003, when the Americans invaded Iraq, I think it was someone in the White House once said that real men go to Tehran. So the United States had invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were contemplating invading Syria or Iran. So that was then. But the Iranians, apparently the Iranians have always been very good at chess. I don't know. Someone once said that they invented chess in Iran. I don't know if that's true. If they, some people, they try to attribute things to themselves, but they outplayed the Americans. The Iranians supported the opposition in Afghanistan and in Iraq. They weakened the Americans. And gradually the resistance in Yemen grew, and in Lebanon, of course, it existed from a long time ago with the help of Syria. So we gradually saw the Americans' hold over the region weaken, and Iran was literally surrounded back then. But now we see that Israelis are surrounded. Yemen in the Red Sea, the Hezbollah in the Mediterranean, and then there's Iraq and Syria. And of course, the reason why the dirty war in Syria began from the very beginning was because the Americans knew something was happening. And they wanted this they wanted to use what was going on across the Arab world as an opportunity to launch a dirty war in Syria and undermine Syria, because Syria was very important for linking Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. And of course, the Syrian Golan. So the Americans from early on in Syria, they were funding extremists. The Iranians were saying this, but the Western media was ridiculing it. And unfortunately, many people in the region didn't, they were fooled because you had all of the Arabic media, which is largely state-owned or indirectly owned by different states. They were all trying to undermine Syria. You had, unfortunately, Erdogan, who's now doing really nothing to help the Palestinians. But back then he was supporting these groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And we have to keep in mind that on February the 12th, 2012, Jake Sullivan, the current National Security Advisor, sent an email to the then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton saying that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. So from the very start, the Americans were working with Al-Qaeda, just as they were also doing in Libya. You will recall the suicide bomber in Manchester who killed all those young kids at a concert. He was one of these extremists, he and his father. And they were moving back and forth from the UK. The Western intelligence agencies, NATO intelligence agencies, were working with these extremists. And of course, after Libya fell, they focused on Syria. And Istanbul was a key point. They had a um, a center there for coordinating the fight against Syria from the north, and they had another command center in Amman in Jordan for the south. So, and then back then there was no ISIS. Al Qaeda then split into two. I don't want to go over the history. And we had the emergence of ISIS. Now, ISIS, when we look at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, which stated that U.S. allies in the region want to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq to surround Syria, because in north there was Turkey, in the south there was Jordan, both American allies, and then you had Israel, and in Lebanon. Lebanon was very problematic because of the divide in the country, so they wanted to cut off Syria from Iraq. Who was that Salafist entity? It was ISIS. ISIS was that Salafist entity, that state that established itself between Syria and Iraq. And of course, General Michael Flynn, who we all know, who was briefly the national security advisor for Trump, admitted in an interview on Al Jazeera, of all places, with Mehdi Hassan, of all people, that the U.S. government took a willful decision to support this. So the Americans knew that this axis of resistance, the only way to break it was to the only place where they could possibly break it was in Syria. Unfortunately, unfortunately, they failed, and they tried to convince Erdogan to be a part of this, and Erdogan could take parts of Syria and increase his influence in Syria and become a sultan of sorts. And he destroyed much of Syria. Now he's talking about rapprochement with President Assad. Well, if President Assad is so bad, then how can you have rapprochement with him? So in any case, I mean, this is a dark past that is painful to go over, and even some people still now don't see the truth as it was. But the point that I'm making is that the Americans tried to undermine Syria. They were desperate to undermine Syria, the Americans and their allies, because for the Americans, it was the way to weaken this axis of resistance. And the axis of resistance has been set up to help the people of Palestine. Iran has no, Lebanon, right now, if Hezbollah does a deal with the Americans, do you think the Americans do you think the United States and Israel is willing to give significant concessions to Hezbollah right now? Without a doubt. Do you think the Americans are right now willing to give enormous concessions to Ansarullah in Yemen right now? Absolutely. Do you think the Americans are willing to give huge concessions to Iran if Iran just gives up on the Palestinian cause? They'll give Iran the world. But this is an issue of principle. All of this is to end this ethno-supremacist regime and to bring about a state where Jews, Christians, and Muslims can live side by side. Remember, and I'm sure you know this, in Iran we have Jews. In Iran we have synagogues. In Tehran we have kosher restaurants. In parliament we have a Jewish parliamentarian. When they say anti-Semitism, in my opinion, the anti-Semites are the Zionists, because they're the ones who are trying to present themselves as representative of all Jews. Whereas, fortunately today, young Jews across the world, especially in the United States, are standing up and resisting Zionism. And you know many of them, and they've been on your show, I'm sure, and we all know who they are. I don't want to mention names because there are many of them, and then it's not right for me to mention 2 or 3 names and then forget everyone else or others. But in any case, the point is that the whole purpose of that axis of resistance is to end this horrible situation where you have these Europeans raping Palestinians on camera and apparently showing it as it happens to a government minister. That is what one report that I've seen, that one of the government ministers was watching it happen online. So this is what Iran wants to end. And of course, we're evil. We're the bad guys. We're the violators of human rights and human dignity, and we're the terrorists, and we're evil. But we're the ones who are fighting against this, and the West, which are they love women's rights and human rights and children's rights and animal rights and the environment, and they're so wonderful. They're the ones who are supporting this horrible regime.
Yes, indeed. And maybe final comment on this before we get to one last story, Professor Marandi. Um, Given all that you said about how the axis of resistance has been strengthened by all of these examples you gave about what the U.S. and what Israel has been doing in this region, could you talk about now, in this reality that, some have criticized Russia and China's relationship to Israel and to overall what they've done around Gaza. But one thing that's been so striking over the many years now is that all those factors that you mentioned has actually allowed Russia and China to both maintain a certain level of diplomacy and to be part of the world system while also recognizing the axis of resistance. Russia and China are some of the two major powers that meet regularly with Hezbollah, that meet with the Palestinian resistance, that recognize Ansar Allah as a legitimate political force. What do you have to say about how the axis of resistance then factors into this growing multipolar world?
Well, in an ideal world, Russia, China, and other powers would break off all ties with the Israeli regime. And maybe we'll reach a point where that happens. I mean, after all, when they keep raping and murdering and slaughtering, they are going to diminish themselves, and they're going to destroy their future, and they're going to grow weaker and weaker. So who knows what will happen in the years ahead. So but in any case, in an ideal world, I'd like them to break off ties. But at the moment, Russia and China and most countries across the global south have taken a very harsh stance against the Israelis. But then again, when regional countries refuse to break off ties, when Turkey refuses to break off ties, when Jordan, when the Emirates, when Egypt, when all of these countries, when Morocco and others refuse to break off ties with this genocidal regime, then we can't have unrealistic expectations of countries outside of the region who don't necessarily see the world the way we do, and they have other considerations for themselves. The right thing to do, in my opinion, is for everyone to break off ties with the regime. But in any case, that's not exactly what's happening right now. But I think that we should put pressure on regional countries to end their relationship. And it's very interesting how some people attack Iran or the resistance for not doing enough, or they're already saying that Iran will not strike the Israeli regime, whereas they should be focusing on those countries that are doing nothing, that are continuing to allow their business people to do trade, that are allowing third parties to do trade with Israel, that have diplomatic ties with the Israeli regime. I think we must all collectively put pressure, because we're all a part of the resistance. The axis of resistance is the military wing, but the whole of humanity is a part of the resistance. We have to collectively put pressure on governments, on global institutions, on regional institutions to cut ties with this regime, whether it's in Africa or North Africa or West Asia or Europe or wherever. We all have to play a role. We all have to constantly carry out our responsibility and do more for the sake of the Palestinian people. What is going on in Gaza it's our responsibility to end it. Each and every one of us as individuals, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or on the streets, we have to do more, whether it's through boycotting Western goods. Even in the West, if I was in the West, I would boycott Western goods. I would not go to many of these places or purchase many of these goods that people speak about. And if I was outside the West, I would boycott altogether. That's what I personally believe. I think everyone has to do what they can. But I am optimistic about the future. The relationship between the Israeli regime and China is not good. The relationship with Russia is not good. Compared to a year ago, today, the relationship has changed dramatically. And the view of people in China and Russia towards the Israeli regime has changed dramatically. And I think that's a big plus. Even in India, you were referring to Thomas Friedman. A few months ago, he wrote an article for the New York Times. In one of his articles, he said that I just came back from India, the Emirates, and Jordan, and things are not good. That means even in India, where unfortunately a segment of the population, a significant segment of the population, was supportive of and continues to be supportive of the regime, things have changed. Many Indians of different religious and ethnic backgrounds are seeing what's happening in Gaza. They're seeing what's happening in Palestine, and even the mood there has changed. So I'm optimistic about the future. It's very painful to see U.S. senators and Congress people talking, supporting this genocide. It's very painful to see Western politicians supporting ethno-supremacism. They're very, it's amazing how any human being could do such a thing. It's utterly evil. It's very painful to watch the footage that we're seeing every day online. But I'm very optimistic because across the world and in the West, public opinion has changed, and many governments have changed their position. And the resistance, which is at the heart of this struggle, the axis of resistance, is doing a lot to weaken this regime. And Iran will continue to support Gaza, just as it is now. The resistance in Gaza is due to the heroism of the people and the resistance and the fighters, but obviously the Iranians are doing all sorts of things there. We know that. Or in Lebanon, or in Yemen, or in Iraq and Syria. Iran will continue to support this collective resistance until racism and apartheid in Palestine comes to an end.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.